Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Welcome to our big picture session on radical sustainability. This is one of three such sessions we're holding during this out of lab experience. The others addressed resiliency and equity. They're open to the public and will be accessible afterwards. We see these discussions as basic principles and goals that bind us together as a lab and define our role in society. They focus and give meaning to our research and invention. In March, when the pandemic began, my group was working on broadcast news. I told them to start grabbing stories because we finally had an issue that affected all and was not polarizing. They laughed, and they were right. It became political almost immediately. So much seems to follow that path, especially when it impacts economics. Sustainability is in that mold. It has global impact, and it will be reflected in everything we do, from the small to the large. And these types of problems are what we call gnarly. They don't admit to easy or one-dimensional answers. It's even more complicated when the impacts are delayed or unequally distributed. Psychologically, we're just not very good at these issues, which is why we play the lottery and don't save for retirement. Long-term and long odds are not our forte. But we can play a role, we can lead, we can practice, and most important, we can invent. And that's where the Media Lab can shine. We can work across disciplines and across constituencies. And that's where new ideas come from. Let's hear about that now. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Andy, and welcome to all of you who are joining us today. Today's discussion is on radical sustainability, and we are following on a wonderful series of conversations. I hope you'll check out all of them. Our first day focused on the topic of resilience. We continue with a great discussion yesterday on equity and technology. Today, we're capping off another equally important topic, and one that brings us all together. I hope that at the end of this session, you find yourself asking, what can I do in my current job to address the topic of sustainability, considering environmental, economic, and social dimensions that we can use to make the world safe for people from all different backgrounds in the future to come? We at the Media Lab, along with our collaborators and consortium members, are joining the global community to ask what are the key topics that we should prioritize as research areas. Sustainability is certainly one of them. In my work leading the Space-Enabled Research Group, sustainability has a very broad definition. We consider every level of our human impact on the oceans, the land, the atmosphere, and even going beyond the atmosphere of planet Earth into the orbit around the Earth, and asking what will it mean for sustainability to continue as humans advance our activity beyond Earth's orbit and into places like the Moon and Mars. We must set standards for ourselves to be sustainable at all those levels. I teach a class every fall in which I teach a set of students who come from a variety of backgrounds. They are architects and designers, engineers and scientists and artists. And I teach them history, especially of the last 500 years, asking the question, what are the key actions that humans have put in place with our global economic systems of trade, of consumption and production of natural resources, of the use of products that we sell around the world through labor exchange through different countries. And we identify how these long history and this pattern of the last 500 years or so, of course, in many ways affected by injustice in the form of colonialism and slavery, has given us a foundation that I would say is not sustainable today. And this is one of the reasons we have goals such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a list of visions for how we're going to address key issues like poverty and ensuring people around the world have access to food and healthcare and energy, and asking how we're going to respond to issues such as climate change. This is one way to help us think about making progress towards sustainability. But we can also ask the harder question, which is, why have we created a world where so many billions don't currently have guaranteed access to basic needs like food and water? What kind of future do we want to create instead, in which there's flourishing opportunities for people no matter where they live, no matter where they're born, and what kind of country they live in? So we are asking ourselves today how we can combine concerns about the environment, social relationships, and economic relationships, and consider a very holistic view of sustainability. We'll have an opportunity for several conversations today, especially with leaders in the Media Lab, who are considering three key activities the Media Lab offers in support of sustainability research. This includes three topics. The first is sensing the environment. The second is engaging creatively with communities to understand future and long-term challenges mediated by technology. And the third talks about the idea of engaging in artistic practice as a mode of inquiry and of spurring action on issues like sustainability. Before we go to that discussion, I'm so pleased to invite to join me our opening conversation, Professor David Lagamasino, who's assistant professor in coastal studies at East Carolina University. And a great collaborator of mine. David and I have the pleasure of traveling all over the world together, sometimes virtually, but often in person, where we have the chance to ask questions around what are some of the key issues for sustainability, especially for coastal communities that are often at the front lines of experiencing the impacts of climate change right now. Welcome, David. So glad to have you.
Great. Thank you for having me. Yes.
Now, David, let's start with your title. And so congratulations to you and recently for starting this position of assistant professor in coastal studies. Can you describe what does the phrase coastal studies mean in this field and sort of where are your concerns? Which parts of the world are you concerned about?
Right. So, our focus then on coastal studies is really sort of looking at the holistic approach of what's happening at our coastlines, right? Integrating both the natural system and the human system, right? We know that, that these processes are intertwined, that they do interact together, and it's not just one system sort of driving everything. Humans do have a significant impact, and so what we're looking at and what we're focused on in our research in the Department of Coastal Studies is integrating across those different disciplines to understand what are the economics, what are the human dimensions that are driving some of these changes along the coast, as well as, how are climate change, environmental changes then impacting the humans on those coastlines.
And of course, coastlines occur all over the world, but I think you in particular in your work have a history of focusing on the region near the equator. Can you talk about some of the locations where you've done coastal studies work, both field work in the data collection mode as well as analysis?
Sure. Yeah. So we've worked in a number of tropical and subtropical countries, looking at the impacts of sort of land conversions along the coast. We work a lot in West Africa, and we visited Benin and Cote d'Ivoire, as Gabon, and sort of understanding what challenges they're facing along the coast. And as well as we focus a lot in the Caribbean and in South America, looking at, again, sort of disturbances related to tropical storms and what that may mean for changing economics and changing sort of resilience and sustainability of these coastlines. As well as we're also focused a lot in South Asia, looking into Indonesia and the impacts of different types of disturbances, again, both natural and sort of human disturbances along those coastlines, and understanding what that means both for the natural and human systems.
Thank you, David. We've just done a bit of a mental tour around the world, kind of thinking geographically, going from the Caribbean toward Africa, both on the east and west coast, into the Asian region. And as we've done that tour, I think you've really had a chance to see some of the common hazards that are facing, especially major cities that are coastal cities that are often, I have to be honest, are relics of the colonial era. A number of cities were created as part of a place to have a port and to basically be able to ship off items that were being extracted, also natural resources and other locally developed products. And so many of these cities are highly populated and they're on coastal areas and they're experiencing the effects of climate change right now. And so what are some of the patterns you've seen affecting these large, important coastal economic zones that are really spread across this location around the equator?
Right. I think that's a great question there. And so in terms of some of the coastal processes, right, the natural parts of these, we do see very similar type interactions in terms of how set deposited and moved around. In some areas, in the case of the Caribbean and parts of South Asia, we do see lots of sort of cyclonic events, right? So tropical cyclones that are affecting these different regions. In the case for West Africa, they're not having cyclones, but they have a different sort of set of disturbances, particularly related to sort of human disturbances, right? So land cover and land use change, as we say, right? So the conversion of land, of natural land to something else, whether that is designing or building new cities and expanding along those cities, ports, as you mentioned, as well as the conversion to commodities. So looking at the expansion of or shrimp, so aquaculture in these different areas. And so that has to take up some type of land. So we see this conversion, and in those conversions, we start to lose some of that resilience and sustainability that our natural ecosystems provide to those coastlines.
Thank you for that summary. And of course, as we reflect on this, this also is describing what's the relationship between these locations, a lot of these coastal cities that are playing a key role in the economic zone of their country, but they're also a key part of the economic system of the whole world, right? So you mentioned a few key industries. We can add some more. You mentioned shrimp just now, which of course we're talking about shrimp that are often exported to other parts of the world. And we can talk also about industries like oil and areas where even like gold mining, some of our work is looking at places in West Africa where they're deeply linked to these global industries. How are you seeing this industrial activity affect the health from the economic and social point of view of the communities in these coastal areas?
Right, and again, another great point there is a lot of these things we think of the coastal zone, this sort of fringe along our countries along the world, but it's also what's happening upstream. And so you mentioned we do have some work going on in Ghana looking at the expansion of gold mining in within the region, and we see this sort of increase that's driven by sort of the price of gold, and so that's being exported out of that region. And so a lot of that mining isn't necessarily happening along the coast, but the tailing, sort of the stuff that comes off of that mine then gets washed out to shore. So you start to think about some of the pollutants and sediment that's being carried that then is impacting other types of those ecosystem services along the coast. Now, you mentioned some of the petroleum. We have work going on in the Niger Delta in Nigeria looking at the effects of extraction of petroleum within the Delta and what that may mean for different oil spills and the usage. And I think really is sort of understanding that social connection, right? Is, that there is a resource that's there. And in some sense, that resource is being exported out, but how that sort of resource is then acted on at the community level, I mean, that's something that needs to then be focused on in terms of understanding, right, that human dimensions component.
And so we're painting a complex picture here, partly highlighting how these coastal communities that are often large populated cities play a key role both in the national and also the global economy through industries like extraction of resources and sort of through mines, as well as through aquaculture and agriculture. And let's add the layer also of the natural hazards they might be facing. And now we'll ask the question, what are some of the innovations we've seen? We've had the privilege to be able to meet a lot of local scientists from these zones. We're talking about scientists based in West Africa, based in parts of the Caribbean and South America, scientists in places like Indonesia and Southeast Asia. But what are some of the examples you've seen how scientists and local policymakers are responding by actually adapting to some of these natural hazards and environmental and industrial activities?
Right. And so as you mentioned, we are working in a number of these different countries and working with the local researchers, local national governments, local NGOs, and knowing that these are amazing folks that are doing great work on the ground. They know what's going on within their country. They have the means to understand those ecosystems. And so in some sense we're learning from them in terms of what's happening. And doing this sort of information exchange. I mean, learning from them, and we're able to sort of bring some of our sort of remote sensing tools. And that's what we've been focused on in terms of being able to look at that bigger picture and where, there may be some really good information on the ground that's only at one specific site. And so we can use that satellite data then to, look at a much larger region and to get a much clearer picture. And so that's where we're starting to work a lot with our international colleagues, right? Our great researchers that are there, and looking to sort of connect these pieces, right? Their local knowledge with some of our sort of remote sensing and kind of marrying these two things together to help provide for a more sort of sustainable coastal ecosystem.
I'm so glad you highlighted that, and we can give some further background information about how we get to collaborate. I've been so lucky to meet you when you were first working as a scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, one of the world's leading organizations for both the design and the development of satellites doing Earth science measurements. And of course, you have been part of a community really leading the way with taking measurements from satellite-based observations to get both 2D and 3D estimates of the growth of forest and changes of dynamics there. And we can give a shout out to our colleague, Dr. Lila Fatiembo, who introduced us to have a chance to work together. So it's been my pleasure to work with you on several NASA-funded projects, both in Benin and Ghana, and now we're expanding our collaboration in places like Brazil and Indonesia. Thank you for being so open to collaborate with me. We have different backgrounds, right? I'm trained in satellite design and engineering, and you're trained particularly in using several kinds of satellite data, both what we call the active and the passive, the kind of way to measure things with imagery, but also with direct observations like lasers and radar measurements. And you've taught my team and my students so much. Thank you for literally spending hours with my students to train them in some of the methodologies you use. I think it's been so great for us to bring our different skill sets and backgrounds to learn to collaborate. And what are some of the things you've enjoyed about the projects we've been doing in our kind of unique interdisciplinary kind of collaboration?
Right, and so I think you bring up this really good point here is working with those different backgrounds, different disciplines, different institutions, right? You're bringing in sort of those new ideas and start to how do those things sort of connect? And so, kind of seeing that and forward and being able to work with our colleagues in Indonesia and working with a wide variety of disciplines there, working across health sciences, the ecological sciences, geological sciences, as well as sort of the sociological components, right? The anthropology of those systems, how humans are using them. And so, with our colleagues in Indonesia, looking at those different sort of interactions of land subsidence in terms of groundwater withdrawal and some of the disturbances associated with that. We have the effects of sea level rise and cyclones on top of all of those types of things. And so it's putting all of these sort of disciplines together that'll sort of help us identify answer those larger problems of sustainability along our coastal regions, but as kind of integrating along that whole system, knowing that it is, as we sort of say, ridge to reef. So the mountains to the oceans, right? It's a whole sort of connected system, and coastal is right in the middle, sort of looking at those dynamics between the land and the sea.
That's well said. And we can really reflect on our experience this year. We started some of our collaboration, for example, talking to colleagues in Rio de Janeiro, city government there that has some great knowledge about, they build wonderful open maps about their city. And at the beginning of the year, we were talking mostly about mangroves and looking at how mangroves are a unique tree species that can help manage fisheries and provide a place to have carbon storage. And then as soon as COVID hit, you joined us for these conversations. We were saying, well, the same team that was previously mapping forest management was now responding to creating maps, considering both environmental data and also social data, but also public health concerns. And they were now advising the mayor about how to use sort of mapped and sort of their high quality data sets to help manage the city. So it's been a great journey for you to join us as we've been chatting with leaders in places like Brazil and Chile and Mexico, Indonesia, Angola, and they've been sharing with us their journey of trying to adopt ways to use satellite data, local data, whatever is available to advise the government teams, especially for city level management of COVID. And as you highlighted, part of our goal has been to use tools like a modeling framework that brings together, in this case, public health data with the environment and socioeconomic inputs, and then ask what kind of policy changes they should make. It's really been a great journey. So glad that you were able to join us. And as we come up to our last 2 minutes, I wanted to ask a question that kind of can go back to our audience. Particularly, we're celebrating the consortia of members that support our work at the Media Lab. And I think we've noticed in our work that they may have a connection to a lot of what we're talking about, even if they don't notice, but many of them are global companies that have a footprint in global supply chains, right? So we mentioned some of how these countries we're working with, they're part of the global community, and there may be employees kind of linked to the companies that we're working with today. What advice would you give to our member organizations about how they can consider getting better data about how they're having an impact on sustainability through their business activities? What kind of maps could they look at? What kind of data could they learn about?
That's a fantastic question. And so I think in terms of that is one, to think outside of the box, think outside of the area that you're working in. One of the things I actually teach in my class is, it's beyond that sort of local scale, right? We look at what's happening around. So in terms of what might be the impact, on your maybe relatively small footprint, what that may mean for transport of pollutants out to the coastal waters or runoff into the rivers, and how that may interact with those local communities. And so I think in terms of looking outside of their particular footprint is going to be really important, and using the remote sensing data, satellite data, to really look at that landscape scale, because then you can start to see, well, it's not just my footprint, it is other similar companies and their footprints, and how those may merge or interact to create different types of disturbances or changes along those coastal ecosystems. So I would say in here is take a step back and look at the larger picture, whether that's just around that local community, but really integrating that satellite perspective or that aerial perspective to see what's the larger picture.
Thank you so much, David. It's great advice. You've taught my team so much about how we can use some of the latest tools in satellite data analysis and cloud computing to really make maps regularly with much less human effort, and to really start to get a view of what's happening, how our business activities and our consumption of goods and services affecting forest and coastlines and communities that might be quite vulnerable to changes in the environment. So thank you so much for joining for this conversation today. It's really wonderful to keep collaborating with you, and we'll check back with you in our future discussions. Thank you so much, David.
Yes, thank you so much, Danielle. It's great being here.
So our next conversation builds on this theme. As I highlighted in the previous conversation, David, in part of his work, focuses on the use of satellite-based Earth observation as one of the up-and-coming tools that we can use more and more easily to create maps and describe what's happening in the environment. So let's continue the discussion on environmental sensing, one of the key areas that the Media Lab can use, and one of our strength areas in the types of tools that are needed to understand the changing climate and be a part of designing sustainable solutions. It's my pleasure to invite two professors to join me from the Media Lab. First, Professor Fadel Adib, the PI of Signal Kinetics, as well as Professor Joe Paradiso, PI of Responsive Environments. Fadel and Joe, thank you so much for joining for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start by reflecting on this concept. I've been chatting with my colleague, David Lagamasino, and he and I are particularly excited about satellite-based Earth observation. We really like to find the ways to use, especially tools from NASA and from colleagues around the world in Europe and Japan, and they provide sometimes free data from government-operated satellites, providing information in different parts of the spectrum. So sometimes it's imagery, other times it's measurements. And so that's one of our favorite activities, to explore all the good ways to use this. What are you both seeing in terms of trends and what's making it easier to take data about the environment? I'll ask Joe first to comment on what are the big picture trends you're seeing in the improvements of access to data about the environment?
I think for one thing, Danielle, there's a big change in the kind of data you can collect. Because sensing now, as Fadel can actually amplify, is cheap. It's getting lower in power, easier to embed. The standards to communicate the data are there in many, many places. If not, it's not hard to put it in. And you can start sensing many different things. You can start sensing biological quantities at this point, chemical quantities you couldn't before, get all kinds of information. And then we have models that can integrate that data, combined with deep learning, to tell you more about the environment, which we never had before. We can integrate with climate models, looking at microclimates, integrate with wildlife models. That's what we're doing, for example, lots of things like that. Integrate at some point with remote sensing too. I know you're interested in that. We are. How do you integrate with the actual sensors on the ground and the sensors in the sky and in drones, all these scales?
I'm so glad you mentioned this concept of models, because of course, I'm trained first as a satellite engineer, so I'm always asking, what satellite can I build to collect new data? And won't it be great to have this new satellite data? But when I spent time working with more NASA scientists, I really found that many of them are asking not first, what satellite should I build, but first, what models do we want to create to describe things like the relationship between rainfall and crop growth, or relationship between the temperature and humidity in the atmosphere and the future weather? And then they ask the question, well, if you have some data from a satellite or from an airborne platform or from a sensor in the water, we'll be happy to include that in our model. And the more data you give us, the better our model is. But the model is really the purpose, because that's what answers the questions we're trying to explore. And turning over to you, Fadel, I think you've been exploring particularly the topic of the next generation of capability for environmental measurement, but in the ocean especially. Can you talk about both the important challenges and the possible solutions for some of the ocean observations?
Yeah, so of course, I'd be happy to. So in my group, Signal Kinetics, we develop new wireless and networking technologies for addressing complex problems in society, in industry, and ecology. And we've been very interested in getting ocean sensor data. So one of the most famous oceanographers of the 20th century, Walter Monk, said, the 20th century is the century of undersampling the ocean. And it's very difficult to sample the ocean at scale because you need to deploy sensors, their batteries might run out. It's very difficult to collect their information and to get location data. And what my team has been developing are sensors that don't require any batteries, sensors that you can deploy for a very long period of time and whose information you can collect. You can generate sort of heat maps of the world and be able to extract this information from the ocean. There's so many challenges, of course, that are ahead in designing the technologies, in deploying them, in working, in getting information out, and connecting it with other data, whether it's remote sensing or the sensors themselves, for example, the biological or chemical sensing that Joe was talking about. And so these challenges are technically exciting, and also hopefully by overcoming them, we can do something impactful.
Thank you. And Fadl, can you just give a few more examples of what you have found as you're actually technology development right now, and you're sort of inventing new capabilities? What are you finding is making a key difference to move forward to new capabilities?
I think the first thing is that there is a clear need in being able to do measurements, feed them into models, and to draw inferences. And so a lot of the new capabilities have been possible because of recent advances in computing and electronics over the past even decade or two that have enabled us to build extremely low power sensing technologies. The challenge is, how do you scale them to the entirety, for example, of the ocean, and how do you collect this information and let them last for a long time, while at the same time being mindful of the impact that they might have on the ocean. You don't want to create new sort of pollution or new interventions that might have undesirable consequences.
Thank you. I think you have some ideas about how this can be done. What kind of materials are important, and what kind of distribution process might be important? What are you thinking about so far?
Yeah, so so far we've been focused more on the on testing whether this idea works out, and we've tested it in the oceans, we've tested it in the river of our batteryless sensors. One concern is that we don't want to pollute the ocean. One thing that you've said is sort of, there's a lot of space debris. How do we avoid creating more marine debris with disposable sensors and electronics in the ocean? And thankfully, there's been a lot of ongoing research on biodegradable sensors. We were talking about these, the two of us, a few days ago, on how to ensure that you're not polluting, but they can be biocompatible. Another thing that we did is that earlier this month, my team ran a large virtual oceans conference where we brought over 1,700 people to Blue Sky, the future of oceans, and think about how we can come together for a network blue economy so that we can enable sustainability and also wide-scale observations, linking in, for example, to what you and Joe have been talking about in modeling and also drawing inferences. And hopefully the success of this would lead to $50 to $80 million of investment from the National Science Foundation into this to empower teams and communities to impact in this space.
Thank you, Fadl. Congratulations. It's really exciting to hear about that community-based dialogue. And of course, part of the magic of this is there's a virtual meeting, right, where you were able to sort of bring people together for lower cost than usual and have this important discussion. So thank you for that leadership. And let's turn to you, Joe. I think you have some examples to share with us, and we'll actually ask you to take it away. I think you have a presentation and to share and a video that will highlight some of the recent work you've been doing. And after the video plays, please comment on what you've been proposing in terms of key ways to move forward with your experience of particularly instrumenting the environment in a way that leads to both science and also community engagement. So let's roll Joe's video, and as we come back, we'll invite you to comment.
Thank you, Danielle.
Mitigating and adapting to climate change will require researchers, leaders, and citizens to identify and address the environmental impacts of changing ecosystems. Thus, there is a need for granular, immediate, and longitudinal data on changes in air, soil, and water quality, as well as microbial plant and animal populations, along with new ways to engage people with this information. The Responsive Environments Group at the MIT Media Lab has a long history of using novel sensing technologies to create new ways of understanding our surroundings. Our vision is to develop sensing systems that track the pulse of critical ecosystems and give humanity the tools to pinpoint and mitigate threats to vulnerable environments. These sensing systems combine robust, low-cost, and low-power networks of distributed nodes with cutting-edge data analysis and visualization techniques to generate insights and experiences that are accessible and actionable. These information systems illuminate the mechanisms and impacts of climate change, allowing us to evaluate climate mitigation policies and initiatives and support community decision-making. For the past decade, our research group has led an effort to monitor a wetland restoration project on a former cranberry bog in Plymouth, Massachusetts called Tidmarsh. Like many cranberry farms in this area, Tidmarsh was built on wetland, an important ecosystem that supports diverse plant and animal species, filters pollutants from the water and air, and sequesters carbon. To learn about the restoration and explore how people could interact with this ecosystem, we instrumented Tidmarsh with a custom wireless sensor network featuring over 100 cell-powered nodes that post real-time data on soil moisture, temperature, humidity, light quality, and more. Working with wetland ecologists, we used this sensor data to understand how soil moisture varies across the site and how different restoration techniques affect the flow of water. Leveraging deep learning on audio and video collected throughout the site, we are determining how wildlife biodiversity has evolved during the project. We have also developed meaningful ways for the public to interact with the changing ecosystem via 24-hour streaming audio and video and virtual reality visualizations animated by real-time sensor data. Using a game engine, we have developed a lookalike virtual world called Doppelmarsh, where online visitors can encounter and explore a parallel avatar landscape with animations driven by real-time sensor data. Visitors can also aesthetically experience the instantaneous microclimates and conditions at the marsh via spatialized music that provides an interpretation of the data stream from several different composers. Our climate research vision is to integrate this level of dense sensing with detailed climate and environmental models, plus leverage our sensing and data analysis expertise to monitor the pulse of other vulnerable and biodiverse ecosystems. Indeed, we have already started implementing this vision with projects like Learn Air, a network of low-cost distributed air quality sensors that use machine learning to generate a self-calibrating model of air pollution. Another ongoing project involves the development of cheap paper-based biological sensing that leverages CRISPR technology to detect waterborne microbes and pathogens, as well as embedded video microscopes to directly sample, detect, and track microbial life. And yet another current project integrates on-the-ground sensor data with satellite imagery to generate insights about the carbon sequestration potential of different land uses. Going forward, our goal is to make these systems more robust, integrated, and accessible, which will support a range of climate change mitigation efforts. We're particularly interested in monitoring biological activity and nutrient cycles in vulnerable environments, which will contribute to better climate models. The sensing systems we have developed are already having an impact today in guiding science and policy. As these systems become more integrated and mature over the next decade, we believe there's even greater potential for them to become a standard implement in the fight against climate change.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was really great to see that discussion. Can you comment on sort of this life cycle you've talked about, from everywhere from the innovation in the sensor type all the way to the innovation in how to present information, both for experience as well as for policy?
It's one of the great things about being at the Media Lab that we can address that whole chain. So my group has done a lot of embedded sensing for a lot of indoor environments before this. When Gloriana Davenport approached us with Tidmarsh, this whole restoration project in this large outdoor space, we figured, okay, let's develop instrumentation for that to monitor that process, which certainly hits at lots of environmental things. But being in the Media Lab, how do we represent this to people in a totally new way? Can we think about how presence itself can be redefined by channeling all the sensor data into people's awareness in different ways? So we've been able to look at both aspects. And I think it's important to communicate this information to people in relevant ways. So in Doppellab, you can experience the marsh in a different way, see how things are changing. We can go back into the past because we have data going back a few years, but we can also perhaps go into the future. So you can take our data, extrapolate it, and experience this world in different scenarios of climate change driven by the data.
And these are such important angles to consider, because part of what we're asking is, well, we'll have a lot of data in the future. That seems clear, meaning these sensors are going to be available. They're going to be lower cost, lower power. We're going to put them in more places. They're going to come from, both in situ, but also above, and then also from space. So the question might be, what are some of the questions, not just with sort of producing data, but with really curating data in ways that's going to make a difference for both individual people, consumers of information, like those who are considering a hurricane warning, for example, all the way up to those who are at the leaders of countries trying to make long-term negotiations on issues like climate. And so I'll turn first to Joe and then ask Fadl to get ready for some closing comments. But Joe, what do you think are sort of the key issues if you look at the intersection between sort of the data production on the hardware side and then the sort of computer science, innovations that are also happening to make data make more sense? and also sort of the policy and the need for a social adoption of data as a decision-making tool. What are you seeing across that larger chain?
Oh, you hit at the critical juncture, Danielle. As you and I have spoken, I think this is so important in so many ways. The data is available, and of course, you can have data say anything you want. If you want to just take one piece of it and take it out of context, happens all the time in the world now, unfortunately. You need a scientific discourse around it. And I think you want a Wikipedia model as opposed to a Facebook model, where, ideally, people that really can read on the data are the people that can work the conversation, but it's still democratic. And data of all kinds is useful. So data from these sensors we put out, data from great EPA sensors, the ones that are still there, and hopefully more to come. Data from satellites, and even data from people's backyard temperature sensors. In some sense, this is all going to be on the web. You can crawl all of them. The whole Learn Air project tried to calibrate that out and make a whole paradigm where we could use any kind of sensor data into a model, integrate it together, and project it out in different ways. So I think it's critical. We have the data. Data is going to come from everywhere. How we're going to present it to people, how we're going to actually have a discourse that's meaningful at all levels about it, how it changes policy. It's a tremendous time for it. We have to do it in the right way.
So glad you mentioned that, Joe. Of course, one of the things we explore in my team is often how can people who are directly affected by these environments, I work a lot in a particular lake in West Africa in the country of Benin. I would love for the folks who live and work in that lake every day to feel like they really own their data about their lake. We're not quite where we want to be, where everyone is just accessing it easily. We're not there yet. We need to work harder toward that. And with that, I want to give the final comment to Fadl to highlight, what do you think should be the role of research organizations like the Media Lab to create this vision that Joe is talking about, a world where data is both available but also used in a healthy way for society?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I do want to highlight is that the project, the TED-March project that Joe talked about, is very, very hard. And sometimes, when we look at it, it seems very integrative. So how do you ask the hard engineering challenges, and then how do you connect them to people? I think it's going to be a big challenge. And on my end, we are very interested in the oceans and doing something for the oceans, similar to what Joe did for Marsh. And I think there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of opportunities, given that 80% of the ocean has never been observed or explored. So hopefully this integrative agenda would enable us to deliver on sort of the vision of radical sustainability.
Well said. And with that, I want to thank you both so much for joining this discussion. We've created a list of wonderful and challenging projects to work on for years to come. We welcome our member organizations to join us in these challenges. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Fadl.
Thank you, Danielle.
Our next conversation takes us to another chapter of some of the key strengths of the Media Lab. We talked about our strength in developing the next generation technologies to both take measurements, but also to have opportunities to transfer information from data into knowledge for communities. The next question becomes, what kind of key challenges do communities face as they look at both a changing planet, a changing global economy, as well as technology that could come with new capabilities they've never seen before? We actually do consider ourselves also students of the topic of how to engage communities from lots of different backgrounds and from all over the world with the question of what is coming with technology and how it might affect them. I'd like to introduce this conversation between myself and Professor Kevin Esvelt, the director of Sculpting Evolution. Kevin and I are discussing the topic of what does it mean to engage with communities in a healthy way that actually asks how we can shift power outside of universities and into communities, asking how we could adopt technology to make the future more sustainable. I'll pass it over to our conversation with me and Kevin. Thanks so much for joining, Kevin. It's great to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you so much for organizing this, Danielle. It's really a pleasure to talk to you.
So, we've been reflecting on the concept of radical sustainability and the role that our current scholarship in the Media Lab is already playing to answer some really important questions. And, over the past summer, our teams came together across the Media Lab to generate ideas on what would be really important research questions or research directions for us to carry on, perhaps as joint projects across the Media Lab. You recommended the topic of the far future. Why did you bring that up as one of our key themes to consider?
Well, it's very easy when you're developing technologies or talking with people about what should be done to focus on the needs of the moment. Like right now, most obviously, the pandemic. And that's not to say you shouldn't respond to an immediate crisis and try to address it. Of course you should. But often what we need to be doing is laying the groundwork for things that will happen much further in the future. And in fact, I think this ties to sustainability really well, because climate change is very much a problem that is necessarily in the future, right? We're seeing the effects now, but we've known it was happening for some time. And part of the challenge is the effects, or at least the worst effects, are far enough away that it's very easy to put it off. And what that means is that work that directly impacts the far future tends to be comparatively neglected. And any work that is neglected tends to be higher impact, potentially, than work that has all sorts of people doing something. I mean, bluntly, if lots of people throughout the world are working on a problem, there is less of a need that we need to work on that problem. So focusing further on the future, insofar as we believe that the future can be shaped effectively, is one way to maximize our impact.
And so, of course, one of the challenges can be finding a way to find funding for what feel like, distant problems. That's part of why we're so thankful to have members, right? They give us a chance to give some flexibility on our research. I think your work
Indeed.
also includes activities that regularly interact with communities to kind of ask what they think their future might be and what they're worried about. And one of the things we want to kind of highlight in this session is some of the special skills the Media Lab has to engage with communities on some pretty complex questions. It's a combination of asking what technology is going to look like in the future, what's happening in their own local climate, and then what we can do in terms of designing policies and community practices. What are some examples you've seen in the Media Lab for addressing these kinds of issues?
Well, Media Lab really does specialize in bridging humanity and technology. At least that's why I see it, and that's why I'm here. That is, sure, I could develop cool bioengineering tools, but I don't want to do that without getting feedback from others to make sure we don't make mistakes or inadvertently create something that could end up being harmful. And so being at a place that really values working with communities resonates deeply with me. So the most obvious is probably your work, because of course you take a very radical approach to working with communities, to the point of only joining your expertise to existing projects rather than proposing new ones of your own, which is really a level of humility that I can only aspire to. But there's also groups like City Science, where they reach out very directly to cities all over the world and ask them about their problems with equity and access and sustainability and energy and education, and how their use of design through a iterative feedback process with those communities can assist them in building essentially better infrastructure to facilitate what we might call a better far future, at least in the sense that if you're talking about redesigning what a city will be like in 30 years, we decided 30 years counts as the far future. And in fact, it's what you should be optimizing for attempting to engineer, because beyond that is too uncertain. But nearer than that, and you're going to get sucked into the present.
And it's really helpful too to maybe pause and ask, we're using the phrase kind of community or engaging with communities, and we should probably talk about what that means. I think you mentioned my work, and my team is often very flexible in how we define what a community looks like. And we often, as you mentioned, ask sort of local hosts to tell us how they define their community. So one example of my projects is happening in the country of Benin in West Africa, and the people have highlighted that their key sort of story is a lake that has a set of water bodies flowing into it from rivers and nearby marshes. So for us, those who live and are directly linked to that lake is that community, which is actually pretty large in this case, thousands of people. Other times we're focusing on a particular mangrove forest and the people who are involved with the city level regulation of the use of the land, people who live and work near that forest and do traditional farming and fishing practices, and then people who are part of the university that are engaged in long-term research there. We definitely have been seeing different sizes and shapes of communities. It's also very relevant during this time of COVID, where I've been privileged to talk to people who are in several countries, in places like Brazil, in Mexico, Indonesia, and I've asked them, what kind of community scale are you trying to help out with in terms of responding to COVID? And it's varied from neighborhoods all the way up to kind of the state region in those countries. But it's been really fascinating to see how people are figuring out where they can play a role to help respond. And how does community kind of show up for you? How have you enjoyed and discovered different community sizes in your experience?
Yeah, so our work again is on ecological editing, or at least that's what we call it. And as such, it's closest to your lake example. That is, everyone involved in the lake or dependent on the lake or who interacts with the lake in some way is they would define as part of their community. So for us, since we're interested in altering wild organisms and consequently changing the ecosystem in ways that we hope will help it, our community is anyone who has some sort of tie to the particular place where that species exists. And where this gets interesting is people can have spiritual ties to organisms and species and places. And for many of these technologies, the initial application might be in a place where no humans live at all. It might be on, say, an uninhabited island. But if there's a community that has a perceived spiritual tie, either to the island, because it's, say, near to some place where they do live or where their ancestors lived, or where they have oral legends and stories about, or if they have a perceived tie to the creature itself, that creates a relationship that makes their community relevant to the technology. And so our job is to try to find a community that is potentially interested in helping understand what the consequences of developing a technology in different ways might be for everything that their community is concerned about. And again, that's the physical level, helping anticipate what might go right, what might go wrong, and how could different implementations of this technology potentially help. But it could also be ways that the use of the technology might impact the economics and sustainability and equity that is prevalent in their community and how their community relates to larger communities. And the challenge is it's very easy to talk to small groups of people, and it's very difficult to engage very large communities. So that's a central problem that we return to in many of our different projects, whether they're here in Massachusetts or on the other side of the world.
I'm so glad you mentioned that respect for the spiritual connections that people groups may feel to a certain location or to a species. It just reminds me briefly, I've been learning from Indigenous community members here at MIT who've been teaching me about the kinds of concerns that even raised with this in spaceflight. So one of the students came to my class today. He's an alum of my class from last year, and he was highlighting his ongoing project that started in my class. He's actually from the Navajo Nation. His name is Alvin Harvey. And he was studying the fact that his community, the Navajo Nation in what's now the United States, was greatly offended when NASA actually decided to bury part of the ashes of a famous astronomer, Shoemaker, on the moon. But they themselves felt that that was part of their community. I mean, the moon itself is a place where they have spiritual connection. And they were very concerned that an object of death was placed in a place that they consider very sacred. And they normally would not mix a sacred location with, an artifact of death. And so, like you say, a community can define themselves even including the cosmos. And part of our work, my colleague Fatima Muniapa and my team explores the question of most people groups across the world have traditionally had stories of the cosmos as part of their understanding of nature, of society. And they include that as part of their reasons for taking actions, for when to plant, when to take other societal actions. So we're just trying to respect that kind of knowledge because it often is very linked to really interesting patterns in society. So we don't want to ignore it. It's often information that it relates a lot to the health of livestock and animals and, of babies being born and other things that matter a lot to people's lives. We want to respect that and honor that. And so it's something that we have to constantly ask, how can we both respect and also help to maintain the ongoing availability of knowledge held by Indigenous groups, especially, where often their ability to transfer their information in their own language has been threatened by just many societal factors, and their ability to stay on their own land can be threatened. So that's one example where I've noticed the spiritual connections is quite important, even when asking what's happening in space. Let's hear more about your experience. In particular, I know you've done a lot of work in New Zealand, and I'll ask you, because you've been teaching me how to say the local name for New Zealand properly. Please share more about your experience there and how you've been communicating with the Maori community about their concerns for introducing new technologies like gene editing.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting story because we didn't begin developing the technology with the goal of potentially applying it in environments such as Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand. The land of the long white cloud is the translation. And the reason why we decided to reach out there was partly happenstance, just because I happened to go there because of a colleague in New Zealand, but mostly because we were interested in developing methods of humanely making rodent pests rare. And from my perspective, this is partly about humanity. That is, current methods of rodent control are inhumane. And they're also not very sustainable. And that's because we largely use anticoagulant rodenticide poisons, which cause tremendous off-target effects, things that eat a rodent that has just ingested rodenticide be it birds of prey, be it, mountain lions, other predators. They typically eat a poisoned rodent and they will die as well. And it's an especially agonizing death. And of course, those chemicals also can get into the water and have other downstream effects. And if used in urban environments or where people live, then you see children getting poisoned. So in the United States, there's at least 10,000 calls to poison control centers that require some kind of medical attention for a child who's ingested rodenticide every year. So we were interested in the question of, can we replace the use of poisons for pest control worldwide with eco-technologies that essentially prevent the next generation of pests from being born? And the challenge with that is, if we develop a technology that is intended for use, say, even here in Cambridge, and we're very interested in actually trialing this technology, which we call this overall project rarity, because the goal is to keep rodents rare. We're not going to get rid of them entirely. This targets specifically rodents that are invasive in North America and also happen to be invasive in Aotearoa. But we don't want to get rid of them entirely. That may not even be a good idea, because who knows what would come in and replace them. We just want to keep the population low enough that they're not causing harm. And incidentally, based on their population dynamics and behaviors, their lives are much better if there aren't quite so many of them as well. So we're really trying to improve the well-being of the pests that we're trying to keep under control. But if we develop a technology for this purpose, it's going to be broadly useful for conservation as well, because rodents are the #1 cause of extinction in delicate island ecosystems, barring humans, of course. So anything that we develop could be used for conservation, which is great. We've been talking with folks from US Fish and Wildlife and other places about potential applications of the technology to sensitive areas where it could be useful. But the government of New Zealand announced Predator Free 2050, which is this initiative to remove invasive mammalian predators by 2050, using whatever technologies they need to develop or apply in order to do it. So whatever we develop is highly likely to end up being used in Aotearoa. So I thought it would be very interesting to reach out to the Maori, the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, to find out what they thought about it. And the logic was similar to what you said. Indigenous peoples especially have long cultural traditions, which we in Sculpting Evolution see as the products of cultural evolution. And that evolution has given them insight into the local ecosystem and how it will respond if you perturb it in some way. The complicated part is that cultural evolution, and evolution in general, weaves in whatever aspects of the environment can plausibly be utilized for some selective advantage, will be used for selective advantage, which means when it comes to cultural evolution, it will encode people's knowledge through legends, through stories, through practices, through habits, through spiritual experiences. And attempting to extract something that makes sense in our reductionist terms from that holistic knowledge base is tremendously difficult. And so what we've gradually settled upon after years of talking with various Maori iwis, the Maori groups from all over Aotearoa, is I eventually settled on, we don't really expect you to explain why you think it is or is not a good idea. Because we know from other examples in Bali and Indonesia and similar systems that understanding why it is or is not a good idea in terms that we reductionist scientists could understand takes decades. And we don't have decades for this. So we just take their word for it. If there isn't broad Maori support for using a technology that we develop in Aotearoa, then we will publicly oppose it. And the hope is then that we can try to develop the version of the technology that is consistent with their value system, which should hopefully benefit and at least minimally harm both the physical, the mental, and the spiritual sides of being, as the Maori see it. But also that if they decide it's not appropriate for it to be used there, then we can add our voices to theirs and say, don't use it. We don't want to be responsible for that. We didn't invent it for that purpose. We won't support it unless they do.
It's a really bold stance. And I just want to reflect and ask, what were the kind of practical steps you took along the way with interacting with, in this case, the leaders in the Maori community to find your way to this conclusion?
I found it's a matter of developing close personal relationships. You just have to go there, ideally in person, which is a little bit more difficult now.
That's right.
So we have fallen back on Zoom with several of our colleagues. I was speaking with some of the leaders of Ngāpuhi, which is one of the iwis in the Northlands, north of Auckland. So Bryce and Violet are two leaders there who have worked with us for the past several years now. And it's really a delight working with them because Bryce will say something. Bryce, last time I was there, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, it's a pity that you're blind to the mental and spiritual dimensions.
Wow.
But that's okay. That's not your job. And you're smart enough to listen to us when we tell you that there is something that you're missing. And so that's okay. That's how it should be.
I guess that's a great compliment then.
Which is particularly because I really thoughtlessly failed them very early on. That is the first time I reached out to the Maori and we agreed to continue discussions. We don't have a formal relationship or anything. We're still building the relationships and sharing advice. And we agreed to some kind of continued discussions and potentially working towards a partnership. But I had this paper that effectively said, we shouldn't use the kind of eco-technology that spreads indefinitely anywhere for conservation. That is, the risk that it will spread to areas we didn't intend it to is just too high, especially for rodents which stow away.
Okay.
And of course, they cause economic damage, so we assume people will move them. But people had gotten this idea that this technology that I had played a role in inventing was great for conservation, and there was a lot of enthusiasm to use it. And my co-author happened to be from New Zealand, a professor in University of Otago. And so he said, we should use New Zealand as an example because of predator-free 2050. So we had written it as an example of, if New Zealand were to use this against rats, in the full power version, it would almost certainly spread back to Eurasia where rats were from and do, well, we don't know what to the ecosystem, but it would certainly spread around the world. And therefore they shouldn't do that. But I thoughtlessly neglected to send a copy to my new Maori colleagues.
I see.
And the publication caused quite the local political backlash because here was the inventor of this technology teaming up with a local professor saying, don't do this, which they took to suggest that they were interested in doing it.
I see.
And without commenting as to whether or not that was actually true, it had political repercussions. And so the upshot was I'd reached out to the Maori because I was interested in ensuring that we didn't make a mistake that their local ecological knowledge could have remedied. And what I forgot was that there is local political ecosystems.
Yeah.
And that my action led to some of their initiatives being placed in jeopardy because it angered some of the authorities. And so my working with them made, to some extent, them targets.
It's a humbling experience. And I think you were able to apologize later, right?
Yeah, well, I did my best and they really graciously forgave me and continued working. And continued working with us on this. So I always tell that story whenever I work with a new iwi or a new group of Maori who haven't heard it, just to make it clear that this is, we know we're going to make mistakes and we will do our best to remedy them. But this is why it's so important. And this is why we're reaching out to you, because we don't know the local conditions. They're incredibly complex. They're holistic networks. And our reductionist science is great at the power and not so great at anticipating the downstream consequences. So that's why we want to work with them, because we're not even so great at predicting the physical, let alone the mental and spiritual.
It's a great summary. And we're coming to the end of our time, but I always enjoy talking to you about this topic. And I know you're using methods like these for community engagement, both abroad, but also here in the United States, in places like Martha's Vineyard. And our message to the community today is just that we want to continue to find the innovative ways both to create novel technologies, but also to communicate over a long period with communities of all different backgrounds around the world, especially those who are affected by climate change and sustainable questions and conservation questions. So we hope that we'll find interesting problems on this topic with our member community as well, as all of you have global footprints and are interacting with supply chains around the world. So thank you so much, Kevin. It's been really a pleasure talking to you. And thanks for joining me as part of this discussion on community engagement.
Thank you, Danielle. Take care.
It was such a pleasure to join Kevin for that conversation. We have kind of an ongoing exchange of experiences. And what we're trying to also reflect on is that our vision is exciting, but also complex in every stage. Even if we are very excited about technology's capabilities, we also pause and ask, what are the points of view of people that have been affected by different forms of oppression and different historical disadvantages that make it more difficult for them to use technology effectively? This is part of what we discussed, of course, in our previous session on equitable technology. And now I'm so pleased to invite our next and final conversation partner, Professor Todd Makover. And he is joining, of course, in his role also as the lead for Offer of the Future here at the Media Lab. And Todd, I hope that some people are surprised and will be intrigued by the fact that one of the best ways we can end this conversation about radical sustainability is by talking about artistic practice. And of course, it's something that is core to the role of the Media Lab, being a place that celebrates and practices art, design, engineering, and science. But will you reflect with me for a few minutes on what you see as the key and the vital contribution of artistic practice in the mission towards sustainability?
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this great conversation today. Art has been at the center of the Media Lab since the beginning. Now, I've actually been there since the beginning of the Media Lab, so I've seen this whole development for a variety of reasons. One reason is that in some ways, like scientists, artists start their work by imagining the way the world might be, imagining the way a society might be that we'd want to live in, and follow whatever path is needed to get there. And in some ways, unlike a scientist, what an artist creates is defined by whoever's making it. So there's no barrier to realizing this vision. And doing that, the process is very unusual. It's actually different than an engineering process. It's different than a design process. And lots of interesting ideas come up through that process that are of value to the whole community. When the Media Lab was originally planned, I think one of the reasons why art was at the center of it, in fact, our academic program is called Media Arts and Sciences, is because the founders realized that the process and the methodology of art was different and would lead to different solutions. Another really important reason for the arts to be at the Media Lab is that I've been here for the last hour listening to amazing presentations. I know how great all of you are as communicators, and the work is so fantastic. For a lot of people, you can present data, you can present findings, you can present the way things work, but that's not necessarily the way to get people to imagine what the effect is of changes, what the effect is of a current situation, what might happen if things were different, how things are right now that are far away from us, that we can't see, that we can't touch. And
Right.
The arts are incredibly good at giving people the feeling and stimulating the imagination, opening the mind to perceive and to believe in things that aren't necessarily explained, or maybe aren't even explainable. And I think these days, especially with there is no more important challenge to the world right now than reversing climate change, saving our planet, and developing a form of radical sustainability. There's no human endeavor that is more all-embracing, both in terms of how much knowledge it needs, but also we're literally all connected in this endeavor. And one of the roles of the arts is to enliven everybody's imagination and to help to stimulate a worldwide movement of realization and of action. And it's unbelievably hard, and I think might be worth talking over this next few minutes about why it's so hard. And so there's no obvious solution, but I think it's a very important component to how to move the science and the technology and the engineering and the and general public will and action forward.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Todd. And I'm struck by the fact that my first training is in engineering, and so I sometimes default to my engineering style. And of course, one of the things I've been trying to do in my own practice of sustainability research is to use the idea that I want to remind people to always consider at least three ingredients of economics, environmental sustainability, and social connections. But of course, I noticed that even if I think about that while discussing this topic with an artist, I would say, well, maybe even my list of sort of a nice three bullet point list isn't necessarily the point. Meaning, my goal is not to design this into a sort of oversimplified list that can be solved as a checklist. I think what art also does is remind us that those kinds of summaries, while helpful for a conversation, that's not really how things work. And then actually things are more complex and more nuanced than a nice list of goals or, like you said, nice data sets. What are some of the ways you think that art actually helps us complexify and make questions even harder before we make them easier, before we find solutions? I think what are ways that it invites us to think differently and deeper?
Oh, it's a great question. I think you're absolutely right. First of all, I always find your categorizations and lists really stimulating and important, and so I appreciate your establishing those on many levels. But I think you hit the nail on the head. The purpose of art, of any interesting art, is to ask questions, to allow us to understand the complexity of the world around us and to appreciate the complexity of the world around us. I think of somebody like, you see it everywhere, but I think of somebody like Tolstoy. I don't know if, if you think of War and Peace or Anna Karenina as two examples, enormous novels with many, many characters. And the thing that strikes everybody that reads these characters is that every single person in these books is completely alive, completely a full person. It's not a polemic. It's not an attempt by Tolstoy to prove that such and such a person was right, although, certain people inevitably have fuller lives and their dreams are realized. But every single one is more alive than most of the people you see in real life. And of course, time is compressed, so you can see an entire sweep of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years more in one book. One of the amazing things about music is that I always think of music as an ideal form of compression of emotional experience. One of my intellectual heroes, Marvin Minsky, who at the Media Lab was a kind of pioneer in AI, but also spent a lot of his career thinking about music, used to say that music was a way of exercising our emotions, a way of thinking and experiencing emotional transitions and progressions and changes that often happen over, an entire relationship or, a graduate career. But you can experience that in 15 minutes and feel it very deeply. Also, literally, it loosens up your ability to feel and to react. And another great thing about music is that there are lots of arguments about what music means, but we know it touches our emotions. We know it exercises our minds, and it really does take us on a journey, whether it's psychological or emotional, and it does, but it's not explicit. So a great thing about, for me, the greatest art is not so clear as to exactly what it means. It makes us work, and maybe music makes us work more than most because we hear these melodies, we hear these transitions, we hear the harmonies, we're here. And really mentally, I think you could argue that music demands that we fill in a lot of the gaps to figure out what it means to us and how we respond and literally what those characters are. So art meets us halfway. It doesn't give us all the information. So I think it's a way of inviting people to actively participate very subversively without saying it.
Oh, I love that concept of subversive invitation. I've been trying to use that approach just in my teaching. I tend to start my classes by reading a poem, usually by a Black woman, because I'm building up my own library of Black women's poetry that I haven't really read yet. I'm learning as I go. But we also reflect on the writing of scholars such as Octavia Butler. I'll use the word scholar because I think she is a scholar of society, although she's known as a science fiction writer. And what you talked about in terms of Tolstoy really resonates, this idea that the characters can be bigger than life and they cause us to work. so resonate with Octavia Butler's writing. She's often writing about Black women who do superhuman activities. They survive in violent situations where you would think they would be destroyed, but yet they thrive. And I literally must turn to that for strength when I look at the world being today not as sustainable as I want it to be. She writes these actually dystopic, even scarier worlds than we even see now. But she shows a concept of both envisioning and then making a reality of healthy communities that are thriving. And I think you're so right that then in her writing, I would say on one hand, it's great work to read, meaning it causes me, in a sense, pain to read it, but it also leaves me at the end having grown, having traveled, like you said, to meet that artist. And I definitely agree with your reflections.
My daughter's a huge Octavia Butler fan right now, and talks about it all the time. So I'm gonna dive into her trilogy pretty soon. Yeah.
Well, enter at your own risk, but it's worth the peril.
Yeah.
I think you've actually brought some examples to share with us as to spur our discussion. I'd love to transition to allow you to present and to give us some of the ideas, both from your own work and from colleagues that you respect. What are some of the ways that you've seen reflections on this topic of sustainability through artistic practice? So over to your presentation. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks a lot. So if we could go to a first slide. So I thought I'd show, since it's difficult to understand the impact of art without seeing a little bit, I thought I'd show a few pieces of work and talk about a few perspectives and methods that art can use. The first thing I wanted to show is a kind of iconic piece called Ice Watch by Olafor Eliasson. Eliasson's a mid-generation Icelandic artist, one of the most important artists working in every possible medium around today. And this particular work was from originally 2014, then this showing in London, right in the center of London on the South Bank, was 2018. So as you can see, they're huge blocks of ice. These are blocks of ice. He brought it to London during the UN climate conference. So the idea was to put it in a very central place where everybody would see it. And in fact, they did. These blocks of ice each weigh between 1.5 and 6 tons. They were harvested as free-floating icebergs from a fjord in Greenland. And apparently, the Greenland ice sheet loses 10,000 such blocks of ice per second. That's what I read, and I assume it's correct. It seems overwhelming. So, of course, what Eliasson wanted to do was to present these ice blocks and present what happens to them in a way that would totally surprise people, take people out of their element, and hit you in the gut with what's going on in the world. So it was installed on the South Bank of London. The public was invited to circulate among these ice blocks. Again, these are real ice blocks from the glacier in Greenland. And people were invited to look, to touch, to smell, to climb on, to get as close to these blocks as they wanted to. And the idea was to witness the ecological changes that the world is undergoing, because Eliasson felt that feelings of distance, and we've talked about this for the last hour, how hard it is to see far into the future, how hard it is to see things that aren't right in front of you, how hard it is to imagine things you can't touch, things that don't affect you physically. So these feelings of distance do hold us back, and people become numb and passive and don't act. And so the idea of Ice Watch was to try to arouse feelings of anybody who came close to these ice blocks, feelings of proximity, of presence, and of relevance, that this mattered to you. And there's a statement by Eliasson where he said, "We must recognize that together we do have the power to take individual actions and push for systemic change. Come touch this Greenland ice sheet and be touched by it. Let's transform climate knowledge into climate action." So this is, as you can see, simple conceptually, couldn't be simpler, but the ice, of course, melted to nothing over the course of its stay in London. It created an enormous buzz. People came in droves, talked about it, wrote about it, and never forgot it. And even through the slide, it conveys something. So this is literally a translation from something real that's being affected by climate change into a different form that allows us to understand it in a different way. In our group, it's called Opera of the Future, but we deal with music and stories, always to try to convey some human experience that matters. And I thought I'd show you a couple of examples because this can be done in many different ways. This project called Death and the Powers is an opera. It has a story, but it's an unusual opera. But it actually does have a story. It has a text written by the great American poet Robert Pinsky, and it's a story about a man who wants to live forever. He's actually tired of the world, and he wants to develop technology that would allow everything about him, his personality, his ability to influence the world, to connect to his loved ones, to stay in the world, even though he physically wants to leave. And so after the first few minutes of the opera, he says, "I've made my system, I'm out of here." There's a big explosion, and the singer actually disappears. And he goes down into the orchestra pit. With the orchestra, you don't see him until the end of the opera. But we measure everything about him so that his singing and his muscle tension and his gestures and his expressions are analyzed and turned into everything that does happen on stage. So it turns into the sound, it turns into these robots that he has invented, and the robots behave according to what he invisibly is doing. The lighting, the stage itself is a big robot that moves. And so we're exploring the idea of, can a human being be translated into technology through the story? But this is, again, a reason that I like being at the Media Lab. We also explore it because we built the technology to actually measure this human singer. And in fact, what you see on stage is a technological translation of everything about him, of his essence. And so the characters on stage, along with you as the audience, can ask the question of, is this technological representation of this person the same as seeing him as a full human being? The answer in the opera is not quite. I'll give you a hint. His daughter is the one who says, there's something missing. There's something about humanity that can't yet or maybe ever be translated. So anyway, that's an opera that translates this story about the limits of technology through the story, the music, and the technology itself. The next example, so I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what that opera sounded like. This is a completely different kind of project. It's actually a project I worked on very closely with Joe Paradiso, as I do for a lot of projects. But this one, we truly collaborated a great deal. Just to say quickly that this had a different idea. It's called the Brain Opera. The idea was to give an intellectual, but also an emotional and visceral experience to a very large public about how the brain operates, and especially based on Marvin Minsky's theory called Society of Mind, which is a kind of purely democratic theory of the mind, which says there's no homunculus, there's no little you inside your mind, but the mind's like a set of committees that start with very simple processes and group together to do more and more complex things. So instead of writing a text about this or having a story about somebody exploring the mind, we created a gigantic installation, really quite large, with many, many instruments, activities that the public could try. And I thought of it like walking into Marvin Minsky's brain. So the first act of the opera was to walk into an environment where you were confronted with a driving instrument where you could drive a musical note through roads, a gesture wall where you could shape sound by moving your arms, a singing tree where you could change large textures by singing, a melody easily you could draw melodies on a screen and change the form of the melody, gestures to change big amounts of music. And you had no instruction, but actually what you were doing, just like in Minsky's theory, was putting together your own understanding about how all the fundamental of constituent parts of music come together to make compositions. So in fact, the public spent about 45 minutes in that first room and then went to an adjacent concert hall where we gave a performance of the Brain Opera, where about 50% of it had been produced and created ahead of time, and 50% of it was harvested from what the audience had just done, put together, turned into music, so that you could see how all these pieces, little by little, turned into something coherent and powerful. So it was an opera that conveyed its message through the form and through public participation, rather than through being explicit. The project that we're just starting now is called the Overstory, and this is in theme, and I hope once we develop it in content and form, relevant to the theme today. So the Overstory is a 2-year-old novel by Richard Powers. one of, I think, the great American novelists. And this novel is one of the best books written in the United States in a long time. It won the Pulitzer Prize 2 years ago. And I read about it in the New York Times the day it came out. I said, this sounds interesting. I bought it and said, this is the substance of a very usual project. So in brief, it's a story about the worldwide network of trees in particular and the relationship of human beings to trees. It starts out with 9 short chapters, independent stories about 9 different people who have nothing to do with each other, but who each have some unusual relationship to trees. One might be an immigrant family whose father grew a tree for generations in their yard that finally died. An American soldier in Vietnam whose plane gets shot down and whose parachute gets caught in a tree, which is what keeps him, the only thing that saves him. A scientist who's the most advanced scientist who discovers that trees are intelligent, that trees communicate, that trees sense and send instructions to each other, and that trees not only provide an unbelievable part of the infrastructure that allows us to be sustainable as human beings, but are a large part of keeping the planet moving in a positive direction. And the worldwide network of forests is, of course, being destroyed by humans and by natural conditions. So little by little, the human beings all find that they have a mission, which is to do something to save the tree infrastructure on the planet. Their lives become intertwined. And the most important thing is that everybody who reads this book comes out with a totally different idea about what man's relationship to the world and to nature could and should be in quite a surprising way. And through that, what our relationship to each other should be, what it would actually take to be connected powerfully enough to change the world. So this is a project which we're just starting. I licensed the rights to develop this. The picture on the right is of the reopening of the Barcelona Opera House a couple of months ago, where they decided to do a performance not for human beings, but for plants. So they filled up the entire opera house with plants and performed music on stage, and then gave each one of the plants to a first responder, especially in healthcare in Barcelona and elsewhere in Spain. So my initial idea was to make the Overstory as a project we were in discussions with the Metropolitan Opera to make an opera that starts as a normal opera on stage and then grows as a forest, so that maybe not so literal, but as something where, as part of the piece, everybody becomes aware of the trees as the main characters in the opera, and it defies all expectations. The way things are now, there are no opera houses in the world that are open, so we may do this in a large, gigantic space like the Park Avenue Armory in New York, or we may even do it outside, maybe at in Tidmarsh, where Joe's been working, or I actually just got called by a group who's doing a project at all 62 national parks. So who knows, maybe the Overstory will go to national parks. But this is a story which will be part a story, part an environment, and hopefully a powerful inspiration for people to think differently about the natural world and our responsibility to save it and to save ourselves. Just a couple of more short points. Joe has already talked about the Tidmarsh Living Observatory. It's an incredibly important project. And I just wanted to say that, as Joe pointed out, another possibility with the arts is to experience our natural world, our natural environment, in a completely different way. So through the sensing infrastructure that Joe and his colleagues have installed at Tidmarsh, we can study the natural phenomena, we can see it over time, but we can also experience it at a distance. You know, I can log in and literally see, hear, and feel what Tidmarsh is like now, but I can also see compressed time. I can see an interpretation of that landscape, and as art often lets us do, I can then see and understand things in the landscape much more clearly than if I were looking at it directly. In fact, one of Joe's students developed a headset which allows you to go out to Tidmarsh to look at the landscape, and depending on what you look at, the sound of that particular phenomenon all of a sudden fills up your auditory your binaural headset, and you literally zoom in to hear much more carefully, like under a microscope, everything in the environment. So the arts through an embedded sensor network at a place like Tidmarsh allow us to understand the world around us in a much different and deeper way. And the last thing I wanted to show is work by Neri Oxman and the Mediated Matter group at the Media Lab. And this is a really powerful project called Silk Pavilion. What Neri and her team did was to build this hanging spherical dome that you see on the right. And it's actually a beautiful structure. They designed it on the computer. Originally, all the where there is translucency and opaqueness and actually holes cut in, they built a metal framework, and then they trained silkworms to actually spin on that lattice in the lobby of the Media Lab, to spin according to the patterns which they had calculated ahead of time. They trained the silkworms through the pattern of light and dark in the laboratory, through what they fed them, and through, you can see at the bottom, they actually, like a musician, they gave them little exercises where they got to spin on kind of like little tight ropes. And sure enough, when they put the silkworms on this structure, they spun this beautiful structure exactly the way it had been predicted. They've now done a second version of Silk Pavilion where it's kind of more like jazz, where they've allowed for improvisation on the part of the silkworms, because the first time around they learned that silkworms are adaptable, that silkworms can actually propose different textures that hadn't been imagined by the human beings. So this is not just an example of designing something which is ecologically efficient and which allows living creatures to participate in the design, but it's a real collaboration between human beings, human creativity, and non-human living beings. A kind of interaction which is totally new, totally exciting, and shows a respect, the kind of respect that we need to our natural world that perhaps will save us. So that's the last of my slides, and maybe we could close with a couple of comments.
Thank you so much, Todd, for that journey. I've joined you as we traveled on one hand to the polar regions to think about the future of the ice caps and the effect we're having on them, and also across, as you described, the global community of trees and sort of the global forest. I've spent a lot of my time looking at both ice and trees from satellite data. And of course, it's one of my tools. We're trying to improve the way we can sort of automate systems to create data that's very useful. But I have to admit that the day that I spent flying on a plane over Antarctica to see this kind of ice change in real life, and the days that I spend on boats going among mangrove forest, at ground level, are much more impactful than, of course, the work we do with the data. But both are needed. But I think as you add another layer, what I really want to do is now have people experience what I experienced in Antarctica without actually going there. I actually don't want everyone to go to Antarctica. It would actually ruin the place. So I think what we need instead is artistic practice to communicate why places like Antarctica and our global community of forests are so valuable. So thank you for highlighting this link between there is data, we need it. There's also personal experience, but there's also a global experience that needs to be had. And art is often the medium of that global relationship building. So thank you. Can you comment briefly on, as we close, what are some of the ways you want to encourage our member lab, our Media Lab member consortium community to get involved in response to this opportunity? Because we have this rich community here of artistic practice at the Media Lab, how do you invite members to consider getting involved?
I think one of the most exciting things is maybe to think of short-term imagination sessions. A project like a big opera that I do usually takes 5 to 10 years from the time that you start thinking about it to getting the resources, to developing the technologies, to putting it on. I think it's fantastic. And often the kind of charrettes or workshops that we do with member companies are fairly short term. So we might have a day together, or we might maybe do a research project. But I think the scale, I think this is part of your practice as well, Danielle, the kind of scale that we can do within a class, for instance, something that might last 2 or 3 months, or maybe 6 weeks, something with a relatively small group of people, let's say 5 to 15 people, maybe a combination of faculty, students, and people from a member company or two, to imagine something together. Let's say imagine an experience. Again, the wonderful thing about an artistic project is you can make something that people can then walk into or be part of that is fully immersive and changes the way you feel about something. And as a goal, that's something that together we could design. It's probably a little different than what members might do in the context of their companies. It doesn't necessarily have to be for a gallery or it could be for collaboration and changing the way one thinks. So I would say let's design some medium-term projects that we can build teams together, maybe even make a course around. I love doing courses that are part information, part critique and analysis, and part making something imaginative that is surprising to everybody and meaningful.
Thank you for that call to action, Todd. Let's definitely keep that conversation going. So we've come to our final moment, and let's take a moment for a closing comments. I think what I'd like to just highlight is that I'm so thankful for the community at the Media Lab, and that we've come to an opportunity to ask differently how we can work together across our different strengths. You've seen examples of our strengths in environmental sensing, our strengths in engaging with communities on complex questions, and our strength in artistic practice. We invite all of you to join us. And of course, these are not the only needs for addressing the topic of sustainability. So as we move forward, we'll also ask, what strength are you bringing as part of our Media Lab community? And how do we put them together to together both envision, but also create our sustainable, radical future? Thank you all so much.